to tonight's panel on media editorial standards during divisive times like these. But I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking to you tonight is the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Today, our panel will be addressing the question of can editorial standards be applied fairly in highly polarized situations like now? And we're going to be looking particularly at the case of Israel and Gaza. Bitter divisions over the war in Gaza have provoked a flood of allegations that Canadians and American media have abandoned editorial standards in their coverage, with obvious bias, failure of editorial responsibility, and giving in to pressure from advocacy groups. We have a quite remarkable panel to talk about this with you this evening, but before I introduce them, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of tonight's panel, and they are the Canadian Association of Journalists and PEN Canada. We're appreciative for both organizations' support. Our panel tonight consists of three people and our moderator. The first panelist I'd like to introduce is Samira Mohyeddin. Samira is an independent journalist. She's CEO of The Line Media. She's a former producer of CBC's The Current. She's a CBC podcast host, and she's the 24-25 University of Toronto Journalism Fellow at Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Samira.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Our second panelist is Shree Paradkar. Shree is a social and racial justice columnist for the Toronto Star. She's Canadian media's first internal ombud in a newsroom, a position created to develop an anti-racist newsroom and to make newsrooms less hostile to journalists of marginalized backgrounds. She's a winner of multiple awards for her writing, too numerous for me to even list in this short introduction. Welcome, Shree.
Hi, Jim.
Hi. Our third panelist is Ivor Shapiro. Ivor is a senior fellow at the Center for Free Expression. He's professor emeritus of journalism in the TMU School of Journalism and former chair of the school. His research explores aspects of journalists' professional identity, and he's the author of a recently published book, The Disputed Freedoms of a Disrupted Press, Divergent Understandings of Press Freedom Around the World. Welcome, Ivor.
Hello, Jim. Thank you.
And our moderator for the group tonight is Sakeina Syed. Sakeina is a Toronto-based writer and freelance journalist whose work has appeared in many places, including Vogue, The Walrus, Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Slate, amongst many others. She's a recipient of Amnesty International Canada Media Prize or Award for Post-Secondary Journalism, the Canadian Association of Journalists Student Award of Excellence, and was a finalist in the 2023 National Magazine Awards. Welcome, Sakeina.
Thank you so much.
So I'd like to explain the format that we're going to be following this evening. After I finish with this, what we're going to do this evening is the panel's going to have a conversation, but we'd like the audience to be engaged in that conversation. So if the audience can look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, which gives you an opportunity to ask questions. And so we're hoping that as you listen to the discussion this evening, and a question comes to mind, just go click on that button and just write out your question. And when we come to that point in about 45 or 50 minutes, when Sakeina turns the panel's attention to the audience, she'll ask Ange Holmes, the coordinator for the center, to read out the first question, and then the panel will respond to it, and then she'll turn to Ange to read out the second question, and we'll go through all the audience's questions. So just as I say, there's a little button at the bottom of your screen, a question mark in a box, and it says Q&A under that. Just click on that, but don't wait till we turn to the Q&A. Enter them as the questions come to mind, and the panel will really like to engage with you. Okay, that's everything from me. Over to all of you. I look forward to hearing your discussion.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you all so much for being here with me to discuss this subject. I think this is something that has been top of mind both for myself as an early career journalist and for journalists at all stages of their careers, but also particularly for readers of the news and watchers of the news over the past year and a half. So I'm very grateful to get to talk with you all about this today. My first question is going to come from looking at the title of our panel. Can editorial standards be applied fairly in highly polarized situations? I think it's important to start off by establishing a baseline of what editorial standards are. I think depending on the news outlets that you're consuming and the media that you're reading or the outlets that you're reporting for, this can mean a variety of things. So, Ivor, given that you have a research background and an academic background, as well as work in practice, examining the professional practice and attitudes of journalists, I'm going to put this question to you. And I'm going to ask, what are editorial standards? Who do they apply to, and what do they represent?
A great question, Sakeina, and I do not have an answer. There, there really is no such thing, which might be a surprising thing to say because so many people use this term, editorial standards, daily in newsrooms that you would think it is a thing. The term is used by so many people in so many different ways that it has no meaning. Let me explain. So we do have in newsrooms, in news organizations, typically we have codes of practice or codes of standards that are essentially management's rules of conduct that they impose on their employees, on their journalistic employees, their managers, their editors, their producers, and their journalists. And these can be quite detailed. The point is that people out there may think that they're in fact ethical principles. They look like ethical principles a lot of the time. And in fact, there is some relationship with ethical principles. But they are filtered through a sense of a sort of machine in a way of, and I'm not speaking pejoratively, I mean, they are necessarily filtered with the interests of the news organization to have a system of management, to have to protect their legal interests, their liability interests, into a kind of some kind of way of managing their journalists in an intelligible way. They should not be confused with what journalists over the years have come to think of as principles of conduct that apply to the ethical practice of their trade. You would think that there would be somewhere a set of standards of journalists practice. And the truth is there are also, of course, codes of ethics that apply to journalists. Associations of journalists typically have codes of ethics, for example. But there's zero consensus amongst journalists, particularly amongst journalists in media systems that evolved from former English colonies of the English crown, about the authority of these standards, about accountability for these standards. And some of these standards use words and terms that are very aspirational, use words like objectivity, for example, or balance or fairness that are very difficult to translate into truthfully adjudicable track, adjudicable conduct, that you can actually hold someone accountable for. So I've done my work recently a lot of it has been about trying to make sense of this mess, trying to find some progress toward the kind of intelligible standards of practice that exist in some other countries that typically don't speak English as a first language. But that's the topic for a different panel. I'm afraid the answer to your question is it's not clear what editorial standards are, and unfortunately, it leaves a lot of leeway that managers in news organizations can take advantage of or not, according to their interests.
And so looking at it this way, from these sets of standards or rules that managers are setting out for their newsrooms, Shree, I want to ask you about how this looks when it comes to the difference between reporters and between columnists. What do editorial standards in the newsroom look like in those two different situations?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sakeina. So yeah, I was really interested to hear what Ivor had to say about journalistic standards from a journalist point of view. So this is before I get into reporters versus columnists. One thing is clear, right? Whether or not it's codified anywhere, and it usually is, that accuracy is paramount. And accuracy should not always be confused with the truth. Accuracy is simply verifiable facts. So what are the facts you're reporting, and what are the verifiable facts? And eventually, as your knowledge grows, you keep verifying, and eventually, hopefully, you arrive at the truth. Ideally, if you have the truth in front of you, then yes, that is paramount. But accuracy, transparency. So if I've got information from Samira for a story and then Ivor disagrees, then I say Samira said this, and then I'm very transparent about Ivor. And if Ivor is actually my uncle, then I have to be like, well, I can't actually speak to Ivor, right? So to be transparent about how you get your information, be fair, always, if I'm going to say something, speak ill of someone, or carry an accusation against someone, make sure that you give them a genuine chance to respond, not just like I've sent you an email 5 minutes before deadline and you haven't responded. You make every possible attempt to help them respond. And integrity, I hope, is something that, look, in all professions, we hope that our fellow colleagues are working with an integrity. Although I do find, given the context of this conversation, that there's a moral integrity that's perhaps lacking. But we can get to that soon. In terms of the difference between a reporter and a columnist, a reporter has to necessarily appear to be impartial, and impartial is not to be confused with being objective, because every human being has a human bias. It's just that in the process of gathering information, they have to do their due diligence, even if they don't agree with what's being said, or even if they're not going to like what they're going to hear. Ideally, even columnists would do this. The difference comes in the expression of the story, where a columnist is able to gather all of that information, hopefully, collected with due diligence, and then be able to give an opinion on it. An opinion is necessarily a bias. And to me, the difference between a columnist and a reporter is that a columnist's bias is open, a reporter's bias is not.
Thank you. Now, when it comes to our case study, when it comes to reporting on Israel and Gaza, I'm going to turn to you, Samir, and I'm going to ask today, and maybe not just today, maybe not just over the last year and a half, but even before that, what does it look like for a journalist to see these editorial standards as they are applied to this situation? Can you tell me a little bit about some of the broad observations that you've seen?
Yeah, I think that we should go back to sort of what we're here to discuss, which is, can you apply standards fairly? Well, the answer is yes. We've seen standards applied fairly, but when it comes to Israel-Palestine, and I'm going to go beyond Gaza, I'm going to say Palestine, we see that those standards are not applied fairly. Every news outlet, every newsroom has editorial standards. At the CBC, they call it Journalistic Standards and Principles, JSP. And as Shree pointed out, it has to do with accuracy, integrity, all of those things. But we don't see that applied when it comes to this subject. They're not evenly applied. And at times, they're even weaponized against certain reporters who maybe aren't towing the Zionist narrative on what is going on over there. I'm not sure how detailed you want me to go into, but I mean, if we just I'll take one example, for instance. If we go back to the Amsterdam story that happened with the football hooligans, there was so much media malfeasance around that and what happened in Amsterdam. Right away, you had outlets, repeating what Netanyahu and Katz were saying, calling it a pogrom, calling it anti-Semitism. And many outlets, including the New York Times, Sky News, actually went back. They first reported it accurately in saying this was football hooliganism. These guys who had come from Israel, the Maccabi football team, were yelling, very racist, disgusting things. They were attacking people, right? And then they went back about an hour after, and you saw the headline change. The New York Times changed their headline that day 5 times to finally put the word anti-Semitism right at the top. It didn't exist when they first reported on it, right? So the problem here, I think, is that the public is very keenly aware of all this now. The sort of curtain has been pulled back. If it wasn't before, in the last 16 months, it really has been. And that's just one example, the Amsterdam piece. CBC also had to go and issue a correction just with that story on Amsterdam, because they came out and said the same thing that Netanyahu said, right? We would never do that with another country. We would never take what, I don't know, the president of Iran says at face value. We would never take what China or Russia says at face value. But we do it with Israel. Why? Your guess is as good as mine. But we treat Israel. I keep saying this. Israel says is not journalism. We still have to apply the same rigor, the same critical thinking when it comes to Israel, Palestine, but we don't see that happening.
And Ivor, I'm going to turn this question to you in the sense that when we look at how I know that you mentioned that editorial standards within the newsroom, they can lack some definition, and there's great leeway with the application. When you are looking back at other international conflicts and other sort of moments where coverage is highly scrutinized, what can you say about the differences between those situations, perhaps, and what we're seeing now?
Well, I think a lot in applying standards, I think a lot depends, in my opinion, on the degree to which the audience and the newsroom has a generally common view, a consensus about what's going on. So if you look at Ukraine right now, right, almost everyone I meet, and I dare say almost everyone you meet, thinks that Russia's the bad guy in Ukraine. So nobody's really scrutinizing much how the Ukraine conflict is covered. Almost everybody agrees that a massive slaughter is taking place in Sudan. And again, there's not much conflict or attention given to the language being used in covering the atrocities in Sudan. In fact, my using the word atrocities is not controversial in Sudan, but use the word atrocities about what is happening in the massive destruction of the massive deaths in civilians, of the massive number of deaths of civilians in Palestine, in Gaza today, and then suddenly you're in territory where you will be scrutinized if you're a reporter. And there will be floods of emails to the newsroom from people that are not sent in spontaneously, but are organized by advocacy groups. There's a group, ironically named Honest Reporting, which is basically exists in large measure to ensure that every time someone uses language or numbers that are disputed, then this group, which favors the Israeli point of view on what's happening in Palestine, will ensure that that person gets flooded with, and I'm not talking tens or dozens or hundreds, I'm talking about thousands of emails, of which of course nobody wants to receive, and it can really affect your day-to-day life. Of course, it must be said that the same is true on another side. So recently, a liberal leadership candidate was described as having controversial views. The example was given of this candidate's wish that Canada should recognize Palestinian statehood immediately. And that was an example of his controversial views. Other examples include that Canada should abolish the monarchy, that the Prime Minister of Canada should not have to speak French. I can't remember the other examples. Immediately, a flood of emails was generated to protest that report. I mean, it is a controversial view that Canada should recognize Palestine. Only 2 NATO countries have recognized the sovereignty of Palestine so far. So, you know, it's a very difficult situation that journalists find themselves in. The rights and wrongs of the matter are not the only thing that apply. What applies, I think, in large measure, is the degree of consensus that exists in the country, in our audiences, and in the newsroom about what's actually going on. So, Sakeina, if you'll permit me just one more example. But historically, when countries go to war, the state's explanations of what is going on, weapons of mass destruction in the hands of the opposition, of the other country, of the enemy, you know, or the victories of the apparent victories of the heroes on our side, and the apparent evils that are perpetrated by the enemy, you know, that is the point of view that is conveyed by the media, because there is consensus in the newsroom and in the audience as to what is going on. So I do respectfully disagree with Samira that it is a unique thing that in the current situation, these editorial standards are being disregarded. I think it's quite common that editorial standards get somewhat neglected when the audience is divided.
Can I jump
Sure,
in
but
with
yeah.
one, just, you know, it's a couple of things that I see a little differently, right? Like,
I'd like to respond after if I can.
okay, sure. Like I think it's correct that there is a disconnect between the audience and newsrooms, you know, institutions, media institutions. There is. And no doubt more so on this issue than others, which are not as controversial. But the reason this is an exception, and this is, I agree with Samira that this is an exception, is because in all of those other situations, our governments are not complicit in sending weapons of destruction, right? So if there was no consensus with the war in Iraq, but there wasn't as much discussion because social media wasn't quite as active, so there wasn't as much public discourse about it. But there was the same level of private discourse as is happening now. It was just not seen openly, and it's you know, in Sudan, like, yes, if our government was funding the genocide in some way, would hope that, we would have a similar level of protest around it. And it is unconscionable what's happening there. That is one point. Sorry, I lost my train of thought with your last point as well that I saw a little differently. But anyway, Samira, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I again, I'll come back to the question of why we're even here, and that's to discuss Israel-Palestine. To go back to your example that you gave, Ivor, about Ukraine, when we are reading headlines, Russia is always the aggressor. There is no obfuscation about who is killing children in Ukraine when those children die. Airstrikes don't just happen. It says Russia. Russian airstrikes. It is very rare to see Israel named in a headline, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's the CBC. So there is an exception when it comes to Israel-Palestine. That's why we're even having this conversation. Otherwise, it would just be a broad-based conversation about what is editorialism or what are editorial standards. We're having this conversation, obviously, because there is a problem, a very big problem. There has been an unprecedented number of people, journalists, leaving the profession over this problem. It is exhausting to hear constantly from your executive producers and from managing editors, people saying to you, oh, that's a great pitch, but I don't want to deal with the letters. That doesn't happen with any other issue, ever, 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 ever. And I've only been working in this industry for 12 years, so I can just speak to that. But I've never, ever come across that, whether I was discussing, the Armenian genocide or the genocide of the Uyghurs, the Rohingya. Never have I ever heard, oh, I can't deal with the letters, or, we need to triple check that that's actually what happened. We can't verify. Oh, it's only Human Rights Watch says this. Well, who is Human Rights Watch? Who is Amnesty? Who is Oxfam? We don't refer to China's behavior or takeover of areas where the Uyghurs are as disputed territories. We go by what international law says, right? But that's not, and these are editorial standards, they're just not applied evenly when it comes to this issue. And that's why we're having this conversation. And I go back to what we've actually seen over these 16 months. There is serious media malpractice that has happened. Serious media malpractice when it comes to how this is being covered. Just alone the fact that there are Canadian organizations, media organizations in this country who have the words human rights as part of their name. They have not put out one statement on the killing of more than 150 Palestinian journalists. And the only way that you can explain that is if those organizations don't see those Palestinians as their colleagues. That would never happen in any other place, in any other country. These are just facts.
Yeah, and I remember the point I did want to expand on was the point about letters coming from both sides. And I've been in this industry for a long time, and the past couple of decades of them in Canada. And honest reporting as a group has existed for more than 2 decades. And they have done what they do now for all of that time, over scrutinizing or minutely scrutinizing every criticism of Israel and making sure that newsroom leaders heard about it, journalists were harassed. There are journalists who used to work in the Middle East who to date do not want to talk about their experience. It was that harrowing for them. And so I'm going to say that the response from advocacy organizations against criticisms of against wrongly representing Israeli views or maybe criticism of Palestinians, I'm going to say that only slowly took off in 2021, maybe 2020, 2021. And it's seen as a counter move and a support move for journalists who otherwise get slammed by the one side. That is one point I wanted to mention. And also Samira's point about, Israel says, the regurgitation of Israeli talking points, passing them off as news, selective storytelling. Like this is not, again, a journalistic standard is supposed to be fairness, where if let's assume that we are impartial purveyors of the news and we are giving information, then we should be saying, okay, this is what Hamas did this, and we think this is wrong, and we are going to cover the story this way. Now, here is what Israel did, and we think this is wrong in international law. And we will cover it the same way with the same outrage, because at the end of it, civilians are being killed, right, on both sides. And if our line is that civilians should not be killed, then we should be equally outraged for civilians being killed on any side, anywhere in the world. But that is not what we are seeing. And so when the International Court of Justice, for instance, has begun proceedings against Palestine, that is against Israel, that is a major news story. And I used to be before I was a columnist, I was a breaking news editor for online. And I know the kind of directions that, when you have a breaking news, how you play it up, how you send updates. None of that happened across media in our country or in the US. So it's not a matter of one person one person just forgot to give a message to whoever is the breaking news editor, right? It's across the media. Suddenly, Western media decided this was not news. And the same Western media, the next day, when they saw that Israel was countering and defending, decided that that was actually the top news of the day. That was worth being the top news. So that kind of selective storytelling, and then glossing over violence, again, that does not fall under the editorial standards of fairness. You cannot say, what did the New York Times say? 80,000 killed or 30,000, whatever the number was. These many lives have ended, was the New York Times story.
This many lives have ended. It was wild.
It is like who killed? It's what I call exonerative journalism. It's never that Israel has actually killed all these people. It's almost like an admission has been wrung out of this place that these many lives have been killed. Fine, for the record, we'll tell you. None of this, in each of these instances, you could say that, well, that headline is accurate. It meets the journalistic standard of accuracy. You could say that all the information in it is correct. And yet we could step back and be able to find where it's not meeting basic standards of ethics and integrity, right, in the big picture. Exactly. But I feel the newspaper editorial standards or media editorial standards are often used in a very, it's disingenuous, because they can be used to justify individual lines, individual stories. But when it comes to the whole picture, it's nobody's responsible. That's just happening on its own.
I think that a lot of what's come up in all of your answers is touching upon some of the threads that I want to pick out about the individual sort of elements of this case study. And one of the things that I hear quite often from news readers and also fellow journalists is regarding the different uses of descriptive language on the subject of Israel and Palestine. The Breach put out an article where a member of the public had emailed the CBC, for example, and they had asked why the CBC was using terms like murderous, vicious, brutal, massacre, and slaughter to refer to Hamas's attack, but was using words like intensive and unrelenting without, uses of murderous, vicious, brutal, etc. for the Israeli army's bombing of Palestinians. And the CBC journalistic standards manager responded in an email which the Breach published, saying that acknowledging that no, they do not use the same words to describe these deaths, and that bombs dropped from thousands of feet do result in death and destruction, but it is carried out, quote, remotely. So because these are different events, they warrant different language. I know that this is just one example, and I'm sure there are many more, but I want to kind of hone in on this idea of the different descriptive language. Maybe we can start with Shree. What are your observations about the significance of adjective and descriptive language when it comes to coverage of Israel and Palestine?
Wow, somebody, maybe one of us, is going to do an entire thesis on just the coverage of Israel, Palestine in Canadian media. Um, you know, it's not surprising to me that we would use different language, because as far as I can see, well, even if I reset all of media coverage of foreign issues and begin at 9/11, right? If I reset it to 9/11, from 9/11 on until now, what we see is, when it comes to international news, the Western media immediately becomes part of, affiliated to its government policies when it comes to foreign policy, right? It becomes affiliated to its tribe of the West, and where the others are seen as hostile, others are seen as powerful and evil and barbaric, and groups of people that we, the West, have defeated. We brought in civilization, and we are the winners, and we are the good guys. And so immediately, if there is an attack on the West, the others are the bad guys. Now, I think this might happen anywhere in the world, right? Every country thinks of itself as a good person, as the good guy, and the other side as the bad guy. It's just that the media structure around the world is such that Western media narratives are the dominant narratives, right? There are many countries on the continent of Africa where they get their news from Western sources. So Western news then becomes the dominant narrative. And so it's not surprising that then we would see what Hamas does, or what, especially now since 9/11, the Arab and the Muslim does, as being particularly beastly and horrific and evil. And what we do is, we, as in the other side, does, and the other side being represented by Israel in this case, as purely a defense. And therefore, Israel has a right to defend itself, becomes the gold standard that is not offered to anybody else. Nobody else has a right to defend themselves. Only Israel does.
And I think an additional part of that question is something that people see very commonly. I think I can draw from many media outlets, but there's the couching of different statistics. And so you'll see, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, Samira, but some numbers of Palestinians have died, whereas Israelis were killed. I saw this in an article from the Toronto Star on November 17th of 2023. It's something that didn't just come there. It comes in a lot of places. Now, I want to ask about the positioning of like statistics and numbers and the credence and verification. And Ivor, I'm going to ask you about that. My question is sort of, what can you tell us about the interpretation of editorial standards when it comes to verification, and what that looks like and what we're seeing here?
Well, it's a great question, Sakeina, as indeed have all of your questions been. Can I just start by saying something, if I may? I think maybe I wasn't super clear before, and I want to just clarify something. I was actually not saying that Israel-Palestine isn't an exception. I think it very much is an exception. I think it is treated very differently from those other stories that I mentioned. I was trying to suggest an explanation as to why it is treated so differently. And the explanation that I was offering is that we are in a situation where the audience of the news media is bitterly divided as to what is going on over there. I do not believe, I think that Israel-Palestine is nothing like those other stories, in that everybody I know has extremely strong feelings, for good reason, about the generations of injustice, of grief, of loss, of trauma, of displacement, of cynical abandonment that have led to now deaths of children and other civilians in numbers that, according to the Lancet, a medical journal, now are in the same order of magnitude that are alike to the bombing of London in the Blitz, alike to the bombing of Dresden, alike to the bombing of Nagasaki. That's the order of magnitude we're talking about. So, you know, for people not to feel some way about that, you know, would be to not be human. On the other hand, of course, the generational suffering of that led to the establishment of Israel, for people not to feel something about that if they lost, as I did, for example, 1/3 of my ancestors in the Holocaust, you know, obviously that too, you know, makes it impossible not to feel. So, you know, it's not like those other stories. It's much more like stories of race, of sex, of gender than those other stories. So yes, it's an exception. So that's what I was trying to talk about when I talked about the way in which journalists freeze when they encounter the story. They freeze. And the standards, so-called, that we operate by, you know, when Shree was talking about, you know, I forgive me, Shree, I've actually now forgotten, but I remember saying that's exactly what I think when you said it. You know, that this is why, because the standards are not standards. They are things that we talk about casually in newsrooms, that managers talk about with journalists when there's no real disagreement, or that managers insist upon when they're being criticized by the friends they meet at dinner parties, or by their family members, or because of their own bias. Shree correctly talked about the biases that people have, journalists have, because they're human. And that news reporters, for some reason that people say has something to do with standards, for some reason, news reporters are not supposed to have biases, and columnists are. And people say that this has something to do with standards. And I would like somebody to explain to me why in our media system, the one that we inherit from the English crown, we're not supposed to have biases if we're news reporters, but we are supposed to if we're columnists. Now, someone explain to me how this is a matter of standards, right? So, yeah, so you were asking about language and numbers. I think this goes somewhat to it, Sakeina, even if it sounds like a change of subject, because language and numbers is where oftentimes this divide becomes intolerable. Intolerable to the listener or the viewer, the reader, and intolerable to the manager or the editor or the producer. Because suddenly now, you know, those numbers that I just used about the killings of people in Gaza by the Israeli military, you know, using those numbers is intolerable. I mean, if this were a TV show, let's face it, I would be receiving those emails tomorrow from Honest Reporting, and Sakeina, so would you, because you tolerated these terrible numbers to be expressed, right? So what are the standards? There are no standards. Just to report the fact that the Lancet, a medical journal, published those numbers with a very well-documented epidemiological procedure that nobody really argues with and is not particularly novel, is not against anybody's idea of standards. So why wasn't it widely reported if it wasn't? I'm not even sure it wasn't, to be honest. But if it wasn't reported, it's because journalists froze. They froze under the weight of what happens when these things are reported. It has nothing to do with standards, in my opinion. And the same with the language. That astonishing document, that letter that was issued by the manager of standards at the news organization you mentioned, explaining why to drop a bomb is not brutal, but to attack a settlement is brutal. I mean, the other day, the president of Ukraine, I'm sorry, is it president or prime minister? Someone correct me.
President.
Of Ukraine. President, thank you. The president of Ukraine said, and was quoted widely as saying, that for Russia to send aerial bombs into a city, was it Lviv or Kiev, I've forgotten, is a brutal act. To send aerial bombs into a city is brutality, he said. Okay. Now, if you said that about Israel, that exact thing, to send aerial bombs into a civilian settlement is brutality. Well, here come the emails, right? So you're not going to say it. And the manager of standards at CBC is going to say, no, it's not brutal, something else. Right? So why do journalists' brains freeze? I don't think it's necessarily because they're stupid or racist or hostile. I think it's because of the intimidation and the difficulty that they suffer on issues like this. Maybe I'm wrong.
But I think the question is, why does that happen? Right? I mean, I have very I've had very thoughtful colleagues, and they have no issues when they're covering anything else. So there is something at play. There is something systemic that makes a journalist freeze and not know how to do their job when it comes to Israel-Palestine. And I don't think that it's all honest reporting's fault. There is something going on, right, that I firmly believe is systemic. And yes, honest reporting and advocacy groups like them are part of that. And I think it's important to point out that honest reporting really does live in the heads of executive producers and managing editors across this country and ombuds people, and they treat them as if they're some good faith actor when they're not. And that's, they are basically an arm of the Israeli government. They are a media watchdog for the Israeli government. They pay $1,000 to students across this country on university campuses to spy on their professors and other student groups. This is on their own website. And they are a charitable organization in this country. They give out tax receipts to people. That's a problem. That's a systemic problem in our media landscape. And they're allowed to function. And I can guarantee you that there is no other thing that exists for any other community anywhere like honest reporting. They don't exist. They are not charitable organizations. They don't pass out tax receipts. They don't bribe students to act like Stasi on university campuses in Canada. It doesn't happen. So there is a systemic issue here. And that is what makes journalists freeze, right? To make journalists say, oh, I don't understand. The United Nations says that this region is under occupation since 1967. So why is that CTV reporter using the term disputed territory? I mean, what is this pretend game we do with Israel? Why? Why do we pretend? And Ivor, I think it's interesting that you talked about the sort of that it's a divisive issue, that the audience itself is so conflicted, right? And I'm not sure if you were saying that that's why the media itself is so conflicted. Are we sort of mirroring? Are you saying what the audience is, or is that what
Well,
you're
I think we
saying?
always are, Samira. I mean, this is why, for example, diversity in newsrooms matters, because we always mirror the community to the degree that we mirror the community. So, if we're a diverse newsroom, sufficiently diverse that we reflect the communities that we are supposed to be serving, then we will and we should mirror those communities in the newsroom. If we don't, if we are not mirroring them, there's something actually wrong. We should be engaged with the communities that we serve, and we should bring, and I think we should, and we will inevitably bring them into the newsroom. I bring the baggage that I bring into the newsroom. The only question is, as Shree said, will I disclose that baggage to myself in the first instance, to my colleagues, my editors, to my audience? And will I, as Shree earlier said, actually compensate for that baggage in my reporting and say, I happen to think this and believe this, so I'm going to go out of my way to kind of verify the things that I take to be true. And that may or may, that is kind of a standard in most places, but it certainly is ethical, I think.
I think this really touches upon this very important notion of who is the audience, because it's just not clear. It is nobody actually, if you ask most newsroom leaders, they will not actually pinpoint to any one kind of audience. It'll be something generic, they won't even say middle class, right? It's like, oh, maybe a graduate. It depends on who's asking. Is it an advertiser asking, or an academic, or a hostile journalist asking? But there is definitely a sense in people's heads about whom they're writing for and whom they're accountable to, and then there's a loss of standards when it comes to people that fall outside of that idea, and therefore you have foreign correspondents who will often, it's often been said that we needed foreign correspondents because there was not enough freedom of press in those other countries, right? And they were not allowed to express themselves. They had governmental suppression and all of those issues. And therefore we went there. And yet when it comes to Israel, Palestine, Western journalists are like, well, we can't report because we're not allowed to go there, because Israel doesn't allow it. And while that is wrong on so many fronts, there are Palestinian journalists who are extremely bravely not embedded in any army or militant outfit, just extremely bravely reporting the facts even as they are being killed, but then we don't take them seriously, right? We simply do not take Palestinians at their word. And there is definitely an overlapping here with racism, just as people who are minoritized, and not just minoritized, right? Like racialized in a way that you challenge the status quo, are not seen as honest interlocutors of the business at hand, right? You're just dismissed because, well, you have an agenda. Whereas in fact, everybody has an agenda. It's just about, if equality and human rights is your agenda, then what is there to be suspicious about? So, and in terms of, will the newsroom ever be representative? Representation, I think, has its limitations. Will the newsroom ever have people who actually challenge how newsrooms work? I don't know.
I think I'll say something, I guess, from my perspective as somebody who's much earlier in my career and has far less experience, that I think that particularly spending short amounts of time in newsrooms or freelancing as a racialized person, a visibly racialized person, but still working very hard with the editorial standards and believing that I was complying with them. I think an experience that I had right in October where in a lot of pieces of media, this claim about the 40 beheaded babies was reported. And I know, Shree, you spoke a little bit about the differences between columnists and reporters, but I understand that there are still onuses of like factual and verification that still exist for a columnist. So on October 17th, I sent emails to the Toronto Star, and quite naive, I think, sort of saying, I noticed that these statements about the 40 beheaded babies have been debunked, and they're still in the columns. Here's a bunch of articles. Here's a bunch of places where it's been debunked. I know that verification is very important. Wanted to bring this to your attention. And I got an email back saying that this was a very controversial topic. And then later, a few days later, I saw that with the Al Ahli hospital explosion, when the Star changed its position on what happened in the explosion, it was the article itself was changed within hours. So I sent another email on October 19th asking, can I have some transparency about the time and the rigor with which we're going to correct unverified claims? And my impression there was simply that if verification and factualness are of the paramount importance to resolve within hours in one situation, I'm curious about why the response that I got was about controversy. And I think that experience for me really cemented this idea that oh, even though I'm looking at it from what I believe is a journalistic lens about verification, there are considerations that will never be about verification, such as controversy, that I won't really be able to perceive or understand. And that was something that was, in 2023. It was very early on in October, and it's stayed with me since then. Um, I think the question that I'm going to put to you, Samira, I know we have limited time, but it's a question about sourcing because it's come up a couple of times, like mentions of how sort of IDF sources or Israeli military sources are relayed. And something that I saw and I appreciated in your coverage of the student encampment at the U of T was going and talking to students and people who are participating and things like that. I think that when it comes to this discussion of editorial standards and their application, um, I wanted to ask you about the significance of the selection of sources from Israel and Palestine and how you see them treated or framed in coverage.
Sorry, with relation to the encampment or
To the encampment, but I think also broadly. I think that I saw you speaking and featuring a lot of sources, but I think that's something that maybe broadly a lot of these voices were not things that I was seeing in coverage. But I think even beyond the student encampment, there's a question of how are sources selected, and do you see differences in how sources are selected and framed?
well, from what I see, Palestinians just are not to be believed. From their journalists to their doctors to everything. Israel wants the world to believe that hospitals are not hospitals, ambulances are not ambulances, schools are not schools, universities are not universities. And that gives it the right to blow up everything and level all civilian forms of infrastructure. When it comes to verification, one thing that happened very early on with me was that um, I'm not sure if you know the character of Elon Levy. So he was a Israeli spokesperson who got fired after about 5 months into after the October 7th Hamas attacks. He was fired for lying because he put up a fake photo of Kogat, which he said was Kogat. This is the outfit that's responsible for delivering humanitarian aid or whatever on the Israeli side. And he put up a fake photo that had nothing, that was not in Gaza. He claimed it was Gaza, and he was fired for that. Now, months earlier, I had gone on social media and called Elon Levy a liar for something else that he had said, which was clearly a lie. And my managing editor pulled me into his office and he said, "You can't put this on your social media. You have to take it down." And I said, "But he's lying." And he said, "Yeah, but you can't say that." And that was a real wake up moment for me about journalism, not just Israel Palestine journalism, but it was just about journalism itself. And I realized at that point that I need to get out of this sort of corporate structure where, I didn't, first of all, I'm almost 50. I can't go on pretending that I don't know when someone's lying to me. And I do not think it benefits audiences to put liars on the air. And then you, as the journalist, just shrug your shoulders and say, "Oh, well, that's what they say." How are you serving the public by putting liars on the air to give their side of the story? Israel wants the world to believe that it is not blocking humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza. if I have someone say that to me, that is not a source that I want to ever be using for any story that I put out, unless I'm going to paraphrase it with, this guy's a liar, and these are the reasons why, right? So those are not sources that I will be using. However, if you look at, places like the New York Times, Sky News, etc., they will tell you that Israel says it is allowing this many trucks in on a daily basis, when what we actually see is trucks not being allowed in, people delivering aid being shot and killed, from World Central Kitchen to multitude of Palestinians being killed for delivering that aid. And so I always tend to err on the side of listening to those who are actually suffering at the hands of one of the world's largest military powers. And I don't start from the point of Palestinians are lying to me, right? And this was a thing that came up, and it's a real issue because we don't see Palestinian journalists as journalists. And if you go on, I don't know, X or anything else, and you look at the comments that people put under there, right? They always say, "Oh, sure, he's a journalist," or how are we going to verify that person's a journalist, or what outlet are they working for, or oh, anybody with a camera becomes a journalist in Gaza. That's the type of rhetoric that you hear, even though they are actually the ones that Sky News is using for their footage, Channel 4 News UK is using, Reuters is using, AP is using. These are the people who are providing us the footage of what is happening. And the horrific thing is that they're documenting their own
Oh,
family's
I know,
deaths.
I know.
We have never had this before. And yet at the same time, we are still not believing them. It's atrocious what is happening. Atrocious.
We had a slight context of empathy during COVID, where reporters were actually writing or speaking about the very danger that they were facing.
Mm.
But instead of it becoming a context of empathy that could now be expanded elsewhere, it's just shut down and disappeared, like as if, oh, we don't know what that's like and they're simply biased. Whereas reporters could talk about, their children being afraid in schools and daycares and bus stops, and all of that was okay. It was not considered biased because it's a reporter's experience that was being mirrored by others around them. And Samira, you spoke about leaving. I'm curious, Sakeina, if you have any perspectives as a younger journalist on what impact all of the media coverage on Israel and Palestine, particularly Gaza, is having on younger journalists around you.
I appreciate the question, and I will say that I'll answer it very quickly because we have so many questions from the audience that I will be bringing to you all. But I appreciate the question, and I think that uh, the lack of morale that I'm seeing from fellow young journalists is immense. I think that I came into the field at a time when there have been really laudable efforts to diversify newsrooms. There have been really great surveys of the lack of diversity in Canadian newsrooms, and work was done to address that. And I am the product of some of that work in the sense that I've been given opportunities to do journalism. And then when you get there and you find out that you are in the room, but you are not allowed to do journalism the same way when it comes to Israel and Palestine and to Palestinian stories, I think that that can be a major detriment to morale and a desire to stay in the industry. I think sometimes people say that young people are not cut out for journalism because they're less objective and they want to be advocates. I went into journalism knowing that I was going to suspend any desire that I had for advocacy because I thought that I wanted to do journalism. So when young people are finding out with the coverage and the standards that their newsrooms are imposing on them, that they're not allowed to see one side as human, for example, and they might be being told that some people are dying and some people are being killed. Um, I think that finding out that you're not allowed to do your job in many ways makes many people leave and not want to do their jobs anymore. So I can only speak anecdotally, but I will say that contradiction and lack of morale is something that I haven't heard just from myself. It's something that I've heard from many of my colleagues, particularly racialized colleagues. And so there's so much more that could be said, and I so appreciate all of you for your insights. We could do 2 more panels, maybe even 3, but I will ask for our first question. So, Ange, would you be able to give us our first question?
Hi. Yes, the first question is from Judy. Judy says, I'm here in Halifax, Nova Scotia. A number of years ago, 2 professors from the journalism school at University of King's College here went on a trip to Israel subsidized by organizations connected with Israeli advocacy. Isn't there a code of journalistic ethics that makes such junkets impermissible, even though we know that academics, politicians, and opinion leaders are regularly treated to such emoluments?
Great question.
I mean, yes, it's wrong. Is my simple, my non-diplomatic answer. But Ivor might have more nuanced look, or Samira might. Yeah.
No, you know my answer. There is no such code.
I mean, there's a conflict of interest, right? If you are a journalist who goes on a paid trip, then you have to declare it. Like that, certainly, I would say at the Toronto Star, that would be the expectation. That if I went on a paid trip, if I took a travel junket and then I wrote a travel story, well, then we have a little, disclaimer at the bottom to say that this was paid for by X, Y, and Z. If you're writing a restaurant review, you're not supposed to even the restaurant is not even supposed to know that you're there for a review, and certainly nobody's supposed to pay for it. The newspaper picks the tab. So there are clear, at least if not a code of ethics, there is certainly precedence to show that this would be conflict of interest. I'm not sure why that would be suspended in this regard.
Well, first of all, Shree, we don't actually know it was suspended because maybe there was disclosure. Our questioner has said she knows, or I'm sorry, I don't know if it's a she, but they know that this happened, so presumably it was disclosed. But is disclosure, the question behind the question is disclosure always enough, right? Now I would like to disclose something that a lot of my work in the past 2 years and for the next year or so at least is in really probing with colleagues around the world, a team of colleagues, the possibility that journalists can do better than just having this mishmash of codes and editorial lists and what have you, that is very difficult to explain and that varies so much. Is it possible to list with greater clarity the things that journalists in large measure, that a critical mass of journalists around the world in places where they can practice their trade freely, relatively freely, would say these are our standards and we're willing to be accountable for them. Not our boss's standards, but our standards. And so, as Jim knows, the Center for Free Expression is collaborating with the Centre d'études sur le média in Quebec and numerous other universities and centers around the world in trying to begin to answer that question. And we're having a colloquium in June. Please write to me if anyone here is interested in knowing more, to try to really push the possibility that we can do better than this confusion. But right now it's really hard to say anything with clarity about this question. Beyond, most people think you should disclose your confidence.
Thank you. And that colloquium sounds very interesting. I'll be interested to see what comes of it in the future. And would we be able to have our next question?
Yeah, the next question is from Burju. Burju says also, thank you for a great discussion. And his first question, he asks, how effective, if at all, is the National Media Council in upholding journalistic standards or journalistic ethics in its complaint resolution process?
I might give that a shot. From what I understand, you can, a reader or a viewer can go, I think the News Media Council is just for newspapers, I think. The reader can go there if they have a complaint that has not been resolved at the media institution itself by either a public editor or an ombudsperson there. And it would look into the specifics of that particular story only. It would not look at a systemic issue. Like it would not look at, why is XYZ not treating Israel Palestine as a colonial issue, for instance. That's not something that they might be able to do, but they might be able to work on fact checks or speak about columnist rights or issues that are particular to a particular story around language and ethics and standards. But yeah, so I don't know if that quite answers the question, but this is what I know.
Maybe we can get our next question.
Okay, the next question. The attendee asks, says, Shree talked about journalists' obligation to be accurate. And this is for all of the panelists. What are the distinctions between accurate, factual, objective, and true?
In 1 minute or less.
Yeah.
Samira, would you like to try?
No.
Or
To me, they're all
no,
the same.
I don't think they're the same. But I would say objective is one of those huge red herrings that has beset journalists in our media system, North America's media system, for a century or so. The United States sort of invented this concept of journalistic objectivity some time ago, and we kind of inherited. Look, it's a huge, confusing topic, but in the great news, drum roll, the New York Times has abolished it. Isn't that wonderful? So the publisher of the New York Times and the editor of the New York Times finally said recently that they no longer expect objectivity from their journalists, and now they merely expect independence, whatever the difference may be. And factual accuracy, verification. I mean, again, these words are just words. They're aspirations. It's rhetoric. Until you actually put meat on these bones and say, what do you actually mean? What is sufficient? The same applies to words like balance, impartiality, neutrality. They're just words. And I think what has happened in our day and age, people not buying it anymore when journalists use these words. They want to see what it looks like in practice. And honestly, most people aren't dumb. They kind of get it when they don't see it. That's my opinion.
I think most people also I don't know necessarily that, consumers of news care so much about whether a particular code of ethics is being followed or not. I think the bare minimum that people expect for any media institution to keep its legitimacy is consistency. That you would apply the same, whatever are those standards, that you would apply them consistently, whether or not the institution itself agreed with it. And I think that lack of consistency is causing deep fissures in society right now. And to my mind, it's also causing, there has been misinformation and disinformation, which is such a threat to media. There has been the rise of Donald Trump, which has also been a threat to media, the idea of delegitimizing all news as fake news. And then we go and shoot a self-goal on this issue, right? So it's, I think we as in the media has done ourselves great harm in just going back to knee-jerk reporting when it came to such a major issue that touches, and which is not a single issue, right? It touches upon colonialism and racism and feminism and so many aspects of life.
Thank you so much. And could we have another question?
Yeah, the next question. It's another one from Burju. On your point about the breach publishing the CBC response regarding the use of different language, how much of this perpetuates the civilized versus savage distinction? Is this similar to colonial powers in the 19th century being seen as more civilized in their methods of violence because of the more advanced technology relative to those they sought to colonize?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I always go back to is the way that the pager terrorist attack was reported that Israel did in Lebanon, where it set off, thousands of pagers blew up at the same time, and I was amazed at how this was reported, and it was reported as a technological marvel, the Israel's prowess. I mean, you rarely saw it reported as holy shit. This massive terrorist attack happened. There were children who were killed picking up these pagers. People in grocery stores were maimed, and I actually heard on CBC News Network the hosts talk about Israel's technological prowess.
Also, the CBC saying James Bond style attack.
Yeah, I mean, it's where else would you ever see something like that reported in such a way? This was a terrorist attack. I had friends in Beirut who didn't leave their homes for 2 weeks because they were afraid to go shopping. They didn't know who were they going to be standing next to or what's going to go off. That's the definition of terrorism. That's terrorism.
Right. And Samira, I'd like to actually take this opportunity to forgive me, please, Samira, for doing this, but you just did something. You said you used the passive voice. It was reported as, right? Which is what you correctly accused so many of the media doing, right? The segue I'm going to suggest is, the media are not a monolith, right? Not all the media reported that event in that way.
Legacy media did. Legacy
Well,
media.
not all legacy media did anything of the kind. I mean, I think we can generalize about the other day I was sitting with a young CBC reporter, a student of mine from 2-3 years back, who was frustrated and said to me, I try hard, really hard, not to fall into these traps that people talk as if we all use language like, and we are all made to use language like. And he used one of the phrases that we've used in this very conversation, as if CBC requires that language, right? Mm-hmm. Well, he said, I don't. And many of us don't use that language. Many of us use this language.
Sorry,
and he gave me that example.
What do you mean by that language?
Okay. He said, this language of, according to the Hamas-led health ministry of Gaza, the numbers of dead are blah, 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 right?
Hamas run.
Which immediately, you know that, right? The immediately delegitimizes the reports of the casualties, yes, because it's supposed to be a Hamas number, right? Yes. So he said, many of us, my colleagues and I, we never use that. We're not required to use that. He said, what most of and he's talking about his fellow young journalists that he talks to and his friends and CBC say, the number, according to the health ministry, which is widely considered legitimate, including by the United Nations, is blah, 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 right? And he said, that's never edited out. So, I didn't know that, but that's his account, and this is not someone that I think was lying to me the other night.
But did you find it? But did you
He
find
just,
it in their writings? Did you find that in their writing?
I have no reason to disbelieve this person. The point being that I read a lot of very good reporting in the Toronto Star, in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and in many smaller places which are staffed by ambitious and brilliant and dedicated young journalists around the place who are being dissed daily and lumped in with other journalists by people who say, oh, the media, blah, de, blah, de, blah, de, blah. I dare to say that all of us in this panel would agree that a lot of people are doing really good reporting on this and other stories day by day by day, you know,
But that's not what we're
and
here to discuss.
so I guess.
But that's not what we're here to discuss. We're not here to discuss who is doing good work and who is doing bad work. We're here to discuss whether editorial standards are applied fairly to Israel-Palestine. And I have colleagues who are doing excellent work inside the CBC, who are trying to do excellent work, who are constantly pushing their managing editors and executive producers to live up to the standards that they hold near and dear when it comes to this particular issue.
And sometimes succeeding, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
But
sometimes
that's not
all I
what,
want to say.
but when you accuse me of using the passive voice and saying this was reported as, that's because it was reported as. And I think it's important what our public broadcaster is saying and not saying. And I want to bring up that issue that you mentioned about the sentence, Hamas-run health ministry. It is very important, this sentence, because we never heard it before 10/7. It never existed. Hamas had been in power since 2006. All of a sudden, we started hearing this term, Hamas-run health ministry. And the public broadcaster CBC was using it. I was hearing it on CBC radio. The hosts were saying it. So it's not that, I'm sure this young journalist who you taught or whatever, I mean, it's not to say that this person maybe isn't putting it in their article, but many a host is using that term and are still
Absolutely.
using
And
that term.
even,
And
yeah.
it is to
I agree.
discredit. That is the only reason they're using. And do you know who came up with that term? Because
Honest reporting,
invented
probably.
it. Honest reporting. And they congratulated themselves on their website the first time they heard CBC use that term. So let's be very clear about where these words actually come from, where these terms come from, and how they've become part of the lexicon of media outlets. This is a public broadcaster.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Shree.
Sorry, yeah. Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I'm just so eager to talk right now. But it gets even worse. It's not just the Hamas-led health ministry. It's also, according to numbers by the Hamas Health Ministry, which does not distinguish between the deaths of combatants and civilians.
Brilliance, yes.
And it's these many, but that's not a distinction in the line before or after. When we are talking about the Hamas terrorist attack of October 7th, that's not a line being used. That the 1,200 includes Israeli soldiers. That's not a line being used at all. So there is a lot of obfuscation that's one-sided and happening. I have no doubt that if we went through it, there would be issues or points that and that might be fair points that that would serve Israel better, that are not being carried, right? It's not to say that every single story in every single media is only purely pro-Israel, but on the overall, if our standards are being applied are they being applied fairly? And I think on the overall, any unbiased or any credible research would find that they are biased towards one side, which is Israel.
I so appreciate the thought that we're putting into this. And I hope that in the last couple of minutes, perhaps we can squeeze in one or two more questions. So I will ask Ange, do we have another question that we can look to?
Yes, the next question is from Faisal, and Faisal says words such as objective, impartial, and neutral are not meaningless. They've been considered in philosophy, ethics, and law. They carry meaning in the context of the administration of justice. Is there anything journalists can learn from lawyers to put meat on these bones?
I think from philosophers, actually, maybe more than lawyers. Yeah, no, impartial and neutral. So, neutral in journalism actually came up when I'm going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, anyone here, but I'm going to say in the 40s, 50s, when it was deemed necessary that journalists not take any side, any particular political party's side. So be neutral and don't be overly biased in how you're, if you say something about the liberals, say something about the conservatives. In that sense, neutral. And impartial would probably in journalism simply mean in regular language, don't just take one person's word, right? Like don't be biased by one person's experience. Don't be, go to various sources and get that. And objectivity in humans is meaningless. And there is an objectivity that can happen in the process of news gathering, where you accept your own bias and you say, this is my bias, and I acknowledge my bias, and these are all the processes by which I will get my news. But there cannot be objectivity in the way that it's being used, that it's meaningless in the sense of the report that comes out at the end of it is not objective. Every step in a news organization is subjective, from which story to assign, from which of the quotes. You speak to somebody for 2 hours and you're just putting 3 quotes in. Which of those quotes are you going to choose? Which quote will you put up first? Which quote? Why do you not take certain quotes? Where will that story go? What will that headline say? These are all objectively subjective decisions that are taken in news organizations.
I think, as Faisal is a lawyer, if I'm thinking of the right Faisal, which I suspect I am, I think one should do justice to his question and say, what journalists can learn from lawyers about these words is probably very similar to the way that lawyers understand these words. So a judge is expected to be objective in the sense of the process of coming to a decision about facts. As Shree said, it is the process of weighing. It is not the judge doesn't have biases, but as Shree said, it is what the judge does with the process. So journalists, when they are correctly taught, are taught a method of verification rather than a way of thinking. It is a critical method. Impartial, the word impartial means to journalists, as Shree said, a method of reporting that takes account of what you think you want to hear and sort of takes countermeasures against what you think you want to hear. And what was the third thing? Neutral. I think I agree that neutrality is associated. Well, here's what I would add to that. Neutrality and impartiality are associated with a media system that, again, is the English media system. No such idea of journalism is really practiced in many other democracies, or has not historically been practiced, where news media have historically been associated with political movements, political parties, and journalists practicing news reporting according to methods are not expected to park their ideological ideas and their preferences at the door in places like France or Italy, and have not historically been required to do that. So that's what I would say about that. I do want to also say to Samira, Samira, I want to apologize to you if it sounded like I was attacking you with to my mind was just a fancy segue a moment ago.
You don't have to apologize.
I don't
Did not
think
take that
for
as
our-
an attack at all. Trust me,
yeah,
that's
good. I
Considering
do
the
think
attacks
that
Samira gets.
for our audience's point of view, I would like to say that I think we've largely agreed on most things here.
we don't have
What
to agree, you know.
disagreed about, no, but I just want to make this point. I think what we disagree about, where we disagree, is the way in which it works that these standards go wrong. We agree that they go wrong, but kind of how they go wrong and why they go wrong is just the nuance that we kind of
Mm,
disagree about, and the fact that they're not working is clearly something we all feel quite strongly about.
I'm so appreciative of all of these insights tonight, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to speak with me about a subject that is top of mind for both journalists and readers and watchers of news coverage. So thank you all so much for this.
thank you. It's
Thank
been a
you.
pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank
likewise.
you.
Great pleasure.
Thank you.
I want to join you, Sakeina, in thanking the panel for a very engaging discussion of a complex and difficult and controversial set of issues. And I want to thank the audience for joining us tonight and for some really probing questions. Tomorrow, we will be posting a video of this conversation on the CFE website. So any in the audience who've heard it and would like to let others in their networks know about it, you can go to the CFE website, which is CFE, for Center for Free Expression, cfe.torontomu.ca. And it will be posted, and along with it, we'll be posted some resources. So if you'd like to dig further into the issues we've discussed tonight, there'll be links to articles or books or YouTube videos or others that address some of these same issues. Our next event is going to be 2 weeks from tonight. And it's going to be looking at the issue of what should be the limits to freedom of expression in Canadian universities. This is a highly contested issue. We saw it with regard to the encampments, with regard to the protests in terms of what was happening in the Middle East, but it comes up all sorts of times in many ways, and we need greater clarification because there's increasing pressure on universities to do various things that would limit freedom of expression. So we're having some of the leading experts in Canada as our panelists in that, and I'd encourage you to come. It'll be at 7 p.m. 2 weeks from tonight, and all the details are on our website, cfe.toronto.ca, torontomu.ca, I'm sorry. So again, thank you to the panel, thank you to the audience, and hope to see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye, everyone.
So much. Bye-bye.
Bye.